There's a new degree of alarm today around the extensive communications between Rudy Giuliani and those White House phone numbers. They were first revealed in this week's House Intel Committee impeachment report. And a story out today in the Washington Post says national security experts now fear Russia may have been listening in. Imagine that. The extensive communications raise the possibility that Moscow was able to learn about aspects of Trump's attempt to get Ukraine to investigate a political rival, months before that effort was exposed by a whistleblower report and the impeachment inquiry, officials said. Trump and Giuliani have effectively given the Russians ammunition they can use in an overt fashion, a covert fashion, or in the twisting of information, said John Cipher, former deputy chief of Russia operations at the CIA. Cipher and others said that it is so likely that Russia tracked the calls of Giuliani and others that the Kremlin probably knows more now about those conversations than impeachment investigators. Joining our conversation, former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi. Frank, this just brings me back to that scene that was so vividly described in the Mueller report and in other press accounts of Sally Yates heading down to the White House asking to speak to brand new White House counsel Don McGahn, just getting settled in his office, probably didn't know where all the bathrooms were. And he was told that the president's national security advisor could be a blackmail risk because he had lied to the FBI about his conversations with the Russians. Why are we always in this position where the Russians have compromise on the American leaders?
Well, I think we're getting additional insight into this because early in this administration, Nicolle, many of us thought, well, it's sloppiness. You know, anybody who's been in sensitive government positions has encountered executives who say, look, it's inconvenient, it's annoying, operating in secure environments, encrypted communications. I don't like the quality. I don't like the hassle. Well, we're well beyond that. The reporting now is not so much about that the president is blowing off secure communications devices, but rather why he's doing it. He's doing it because he doesn't like the fact that it creates a permanent record, that phone logs can be created, that you've got to tell somebody the substance and content of your conversation, that there's a record of what you're doing. He doesn't like it. So personal cell phones, personal other devices that he might be using, that's all about going under the radar. And so here's what that means from an operational standpoint. You know, we keep focusing on Russia, but let's please understand that's not our only adversary in the world. In fact, some of our allies will also listen in. So I could sit here and rattle off 10, 12 countries that I know are eavesdropping on White House communications.
Who are they?
From my historical experience. No, we're not going to talk about that. But I'm just telling you,
is it a list of American adversaries? Is that how one would guess who's on that list?
I think when I get to the bottom of the list, a lot of people would go, holy cow, I didn't know that they were doing that too. Wow. It's that many countries that do this. And here's the problem with that. Imagine, you know, we've all talked about, boy, I wish we could get inside Trump's head. They are getting inside Trump's head. They're listening to his personal, confidential conversations. That's how you understand what somebody's thinking. And now, if you can catch them at something that's blackmailable, compromising. He's talking to Rudy Giuliani. He's got a plot about Ukraine. He's got a new conspiracy theory. Well, now you've got him and you own him. And it's not just Russia that's listening. Others are doing it too.
Well, if I could just, push beyond the what to why. I mean, is this tied back to all of this pro-Putin conduct? Is this tied back to his deep suspicion of his own intelligence community, his own FBI, his own, it would appear, Pentagon and other national security agencies?
Well, look, there's reporting that when General Kelly, when Trump learned that General Kelly was creating records of the phone calls used on the White House devices, that's when he went back to what he was doing. And he's doing it despite the intel briefings that allegedly demonstrated to him how easy it was to intercept his own personal cell phone calls. So you've got to come to the conclusion there's reasons why he's choosing to do this. And one might be that, number one, he doesn't care that Russia or others are listening because he feels aligned with them and doesn't buy into the theory of adversaries. Secondly, he does not trust the intelligence community. I think we've learned that over and over again. We've learned from recent news reporting that he's told the people at DNI when he gets briefings, I don't think we should think like that. I don't believe that. So there's all of that. But at the crux of it is when someone is a dirty operator, they don't want to get caught doing it. And this method of communicating helps him evade capture.
Frank is absolutely right. This is the president who asked Don McGahn, why do you take notes, right? He doesn't want any record of his activities. He flew by the seat of his pants as a businessman, engaged in all sorts of questionable kinds of conduct. He gets to the White House. He believes that he has supreme power. I can do anything under Article 2. Suddenly, he finds out, we now know that there are professionals like Colonel Vindman, like Ambassador Yovanovitch, who will stand up, who won't tolerate that behavior. That must have been a shock to Trump, who was used to getting his way. And so as he engaged in this course of conduct, he tried to take steps that would make it unavailable to the people around him. Ultimately, if we tried to hold him to the same standard that he wanted to hold Hillary Clinton to, we would have to lock him up, because as between the two of them, he is the much greater risk to national security.
I always want to ask you what the Russians are doing. I wonder if they're bummed at all the money they spent in the 80s and 90s trying to come up with better spying tools when now they have Trump.
Well, I mean, disinformation is an asymmetric warfare technique. It doesn't actually cost a lot of money.
Espionage, which has been their mission for
now they
decades,
don't
is a lot easier with Trump.
It is a lot easier, and it's a lot easier because of the internet. I remember I went to Moscow. I was the last person in the State Department to go to Moscow before the election in 2016. And I was briefed by the intelligence community, the FBI. Russia is a hostile information space. They said you have to assume every single conversation you have is being monitored in some way. Sometimes they even let you know that it's being monitored. They give you a loaner BlackBerry because they never want you to use an iPhone, which I'm sure these guys are using. And again, it's not just sloppy, it's irresponsible. And again, not to start a conspiracy theory like the Russians do, but I mean, is it possibly that it's deliberate? Is it possible that it's like this is a way of Trump communicating with the Russians without actually having a phone call with Vladimir Putin, and he's talking to him and he knows he's talking to him on these monitored calls? I don't know.
It does, Joyce, just kind of get me back to whether we are too easily lulled into the conviction of coincidences. Gordon Sondland testified, and other State Department witnesses testified to Donald Trump yakking away on speakerphone, or loudly enough that it sounded like speakerphone, at an open-air cafe. I mean, Donald Trump has, I would bet my life, been advised not to do that.
Look, there's no doubt it's drilled into you as a federal employee, right? If you're going to have that conversation, go into a skiff where nobody can listen to you. So, like you, I try to avoid conspiracy theories. But I think Trump has done this so persistently and so pervasively that if it was a criminal investigation and you were looking at this evidence as a prosecutor, you would tell your agents, I'd be asking Frank Figliuzzi, go back out and look at this harder because this doesn't look right. Is it intentional? At some point, you have to worry about that.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.